former president, made a deal with the Taliban. He would get all American forces out of Afghanistan by May 1.
Biden failed totally on the pandemic, and he's now overseeing the greatest foreign policy humiliation in the history of the United States of America.
Australia, UK, and US partnership, AUKUS, our nations will update and enhance our shared ability to take on the threats of the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century.
The manner in which the Biden administration has handled the Afghan situation continues to draw strong criticism. And now the US is also under fire from France over a security deal with the UK and Australia. Hello, I'm Easwaran Rutnam, and this is Daily Mirror World Focus. The US administration, led by President Joe Biden, continues to face strong criticism over a number of issues. Joining me from Washington is Michael Kugelman, who is the Deputy Director at the Asia Program, to discuss the situation with the US and the way it's dealing with the international community. Hello, Michael. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Michael, let me just start off by asking you, with regards to the way the US has handled the Afghan situation. We know that there's been a lot of criticism over the Biden administration withdrawing the US troops from Afghanistan. It's been quite a number of weeks right now. However, has the situation changed since then? Has there been an acceptance of US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I would argue that, as you suggest, the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was always going to be a controversial one. Certainly in Washington, even among members of Biden's own party, there was some opposition to the idea of withdrawing, though at the same time, US public opinion has always, or in recent years, has been in favor of a withdrawal. And I would actually argue that had the fiasco of the last few weeks before the withdrawal was completed not taken place, had the US not botched the withdrawal, then I don't think we necessarily would have been having these conversations about whether it was right or not right to withdraw, just because it had been known for quite some time that the US was going to leave, and it had shared that information with its allies and its partners, and certainly the Afghans knew as well. And I would argue that President Biden had made a very strong argument for a withdrawal, essentially this idea that the US had done all it could in Afghanistan, and that the Taliban had been able to do so much and make so many gains, even with US forces on the ground. The very strong point that President Biden made was that had he decided to keep troops in Afghanistan, the Taliban would have started attacking US forces again, because the US Trump administration signed an agreement with the Taliban in 2020 that obliged US forces to leave, and the Taliban agreed not to shoot at them while they were leaving. And certainly President Biden's argument was to the American people is that, well, you don't want US troops starting to die again. So I think a strong argument had been made back in April when President Biden had announced the decision to withdraw. But indeed, it was the withdrawal was botched completely, and I think it all comes down to the fact that no one in the administration had anticipated that the Taliban would take over Afghanistan before the withdrawal was complete, prompting this panic of thousands of Afghans trying to leave, as well as U.S. and other foreign diplomats having asked where things became chaotic. And I think that we could fault the administration for not doing enough planning in advance to account for the possibility of what back in April would have seemed to be the least likely, but still the worst case scenario, that being the Taliban taking over before the withdrawal was complete. And certainly the U.S., I think, did lose a bit of credibility with its allies, particularly its NATO allies, just because it was not prepared for what happened. And, it put NATO countries besides the U.S. in a tough spot where they are suddenly in a dangerous position and had to move quickly to get their people out of Afghanistan. Certainly, as I understand it, at this point, the U.S. has managed to get most U.S. citizens, most everyone that wants to leave has been able to leave. There could be others still there, and there could be other NATO countries that still have people that are there that are trying to get. But I would not argue that there is going to be lasting damage to U.S. credibility and the U.S.'s global reputation. And you look at what happened, you alluded to this before, you look at what happened just in recent days. The U.S. signed a new major security pact with two of its key allies, the UK and Australia. And though the negotiations for the AUKUS agreement had been going on for quite a few weeks, which means that even when the fiasco of the final weeks of the withdrawal was playing out, the US was negotiating that submarine deal with the UK and Australia. Those two allies did not back out of it. So bottom line answer to your question is yes, the US did suffer some short-term losses to its credibility and its reputation, but I don't necessarily think those will linger. Though certainly the Biden administration still has its work cut out for it in ensuring that its allies and partners understand that the US remains committed to them.
I was going to come to you on the AUKUS deal, but just staying with Afghanistan for the moment, do you think the Biden administration anticipated the sort of reaction that it got as soon as it withdrew troops from Afghanistan, the international reaction?
You know, it's hard to say for sure. I think the administration had to presumably understand that I'm unhappy. What I found rather troubling was that the public messaging of senior administration officials did not appear to be acknowledging and empathizing the pain and stress and suffering of the Afghans that were so concerned when the U.S. when the Taliban took over and the U.S. left, and the horrific scenes of Afghans crowding at the airport and not being able to get in, and of course the lasting images of the Afghans hanging on to U.S. airplane wings. This administration is regarded, or I shouldn't say is regarded. This administration has frequently articulated this idea of being compassionate and empathetic in its foreign policy and its statecraft, and yet what I and other analysts have been struck by is what appears to be an absence of empathy in speeches and messaging from U.S. officials, not much acknowledgement of what Afghans have gone through. The focus has mainly been on Americans, U.S. soldiers, U.S. citizens, which makes sense, of course, because that's who you prioritize first, your own people. But at the same time, for an administration that has tried to distinguish itself from its predecessor, which it is regarded as not at all empathetic and compassionate when it comes to foreign policy, it is a bit of a surprise. And given how bad things were during the last 2 weeks of August before the withdrawal was complete.
Were you also surprised at the reaction from the U.S. administration to the killing of civilians in Kabul, where I think some children were also killed in an air raid, and the reaction there, the immediate reaction at least, was not being apologetic, but more as, it was a mistake.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're talking about the drone attack that killed the 10 civilians, absolutely. This is another case, I think, of the administration not appearing compassionate at all. Even when there had been multiple media reports, a number of major newspapers, the New York Times included, but others had very good evidence that there were no terrorists killed in that drone strike. They were all civilians. But, the administration had described it as a righteous strike. And I think that finally the apology came from several administration officials, including the defense secretary. But I think that drone strike really amplified for many, particularly critics of U.S. policy, that this is really what had been happening in Afghanistan and other parts of the world for the last 20 years, not necessarily over the last few years, but the drone war, as you know, was very much in play during the Obama administration. And of course, the Biden administration is comprised of many former Obama administration folks. And, this horrible tragedy brought to light the fact that you had had many other tragedies like this before, had not said anything, had not rarely acknowledged the civilians killed. And rights happened far outside of these. There wasn't much attention on these things. But then, ironically, right at one of the last U.S. acts in this very, very troubled war effort in Afghanistan was a drone strike that killed 10 civilians, and the U.S. was so slow to acknowledge the fact, much less apologize that it had killed 10 civilians. And indeed, you could refer to it as a mistake. The U.S. was not intentionally trying to kill civilians. But I think that, for me, the lasting issue is that this is something that has happened so many times before over the last 20 years. And yet you would never have had any type of, rarely you would have had a reaction or an acknowledgement from officials about the loss of civilian life.
How do you see the US administration dealing with the Taliban now? I mean, since the Taliban has virtually established its own administration, they are taking control and setting up their own government. Do you see the Biden administration eventually accepting what is and working with the Taliban?
The immediate goals for the US with the Taliban are to engage, but not on formal levels. So I don't think the US is going to recognize the Taliban government anytime soon, and I'll mention why in a second. What I think we can expect to see from the US in the coming days and weeks is to engage with the Taliban on two levels. One is to work with the Taliban to ensure that any Americans that happen to still be in Afghanistan are able to get out. And also, though this will be tougher, to ensure that any Afghans that are that either have special immigrant visas or that the Taliban will allow them to leave. That's going to be a more difficult negotiation, but the U.S. will engage with the Taliban on those levels. And the second thing is that the U.S. will engage with the Taliban to try to ensure that the Taliban will provide safe access to humanitarian workers trying to deliver supplies to the country. Now, why I say the U.S. is not going to recognize the Taliban, I think that the U.S. would insist on a significant number of preconditions for recognition that the Taliban would be unwilling to agree to. I think that the U.S. and many of its Western allies would look for clear assurances on the part of the Taliban, not just assurances, but actual actions that they will respect human rights, women's rights, and that the government will be much more inclusive than the current interim Taliban administration is. I think the Taliban may be comfortable with preconditions related to, security and assurances that the Taliban will continue to go after the ISIS Khorasan group. But the Taliban's worldview, its basic worldview, has not changed when it comes to human rights, civil rights, draconian forms of justice. So I think that the U.S. will remain very strict about those preconditions. And I just don't see, and I know that for a fact that the U.S. was very unhappy with the look of the interim administration, the fact that it has no moderates in it. These are all hardline Taliban leading ministries, including two attacks on to pursue very narrowly focused U.S. goals in Afghanistan. But the issue of recognition is not going to come. And the other issue here is the sort of more complex one. Does the U.S. look to work with the Taliban to pursue its counterterrorism goals in Afghanistan? The U.S. wants to maintain the capacity to monitor the movements of terrorists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS Khorasan. It wants to maintain the capacity to strike them from the U.S. Middle East. There has been some talk that the UN to work with the Taliban, looking at the Taliban as the U.S. eyes on the ground when it comes to ISIS Khorasan, which is a rival of the Taliban. So the U.S. and the Taliban share the same enemy when it comes to ISIS Khorasan. But I don't think the U.S. is going to trust the Taliban at the end of the day. So I think it would be naive to believe that the U.S. will suddenly identify the Taliban as its counterterrorism partner, and it's going to try to work with the Taliban. At the very least, that would require recognition, I think, of the Taliban government, which is not going to come anytime soon.
If the Taliban continues the way it is with, violation of human rights, violation of women's rights, and we continue, like you said, we continue to see reports of them abusing their power, so to speak. Do you see the U.S. maybe taking a harder line with the Taliban, imposing sanctions? I mean, is tougher action likely on the cards?
The U.S. has already taken a hard line on the Taliban in the sense that it has already sanctioned the Taliban. It's cut off access to about $10 billion worth of foreign reserves, which the Taliban government really could use because of the economic crisis in the country and Afghanistan's longtime dependence on foreign assistance. So I think that what the administration hopes is that it can use that as leverage, that somehow the Taliban will be prompted to become a more moderate force in order to get access to that funding. But as I had said before, I think it's unlikely that the Taliban is going to change its basic point of view. So what more could the U.S. do? I really don't know, to be quite honest. I actually think that the Taliban, it may not view the U.S. as an important interlocutor as it had in previous months and previous years when it was negotiating with the U.S. to get its troops out. I think that for the Taliban, it really wants that money that the U.S. has cut off access to. But I think that the Taliban will look to some countries outside of the West, including Gulf countries in the Middle East. It would look to those countries as potential partners and funders, countries that would be willing to recognize the Taliban government and would not impose conditions related to providing assurances of human rights. So I think that for the Taliban, the goal will be to gain enough legitimacy from enough countries, thereby allowing for financial aid to flow in, that it doesn't have to worry about trying to appease the United States. And I think the U.S. likely recognizes that too, that its leverage over the Taliban will be limited for that very reason. Though, to be sure, even if the U.S. if the Taliban starts getting financial assistance from other countries, other capital-rich countries, it's hard to make up for that $10 billion in foreign reserves that the U.S. and the IMF and others have cut off to the Taliban. And
if the Taliban aligns with countries like China and Pakistan, would the U.S. be concerned about that?
I mean, certainly, yes. From a strategic lens, I think that the U.S. would certainly, it would not be a good strategic outcome for the U.S. if its top rivals are deepening their with the Taliban. I think that was in some ways a foregone conclusion, right? I mean, it was clear when the U.S. left, you were going to have key U.S. rivals move in to deepen their footprint. I mean, as you know, I mean, it's a basic fact that some of some of America's top rivals happen to be key regional players in Afghanistan: Russia, Iran, and China, along with difficult partners like Pakistan. And I don't think, though, that we're going to look at an automatic situation of, the U.S. has left. That means China, Russia, and Iran are going to move in pell-mell and deepen their footprint. Yes, these countries I'm talking about, Russia, Iran, China, Turkey, some of the Gulf countries, they, I think, will be among the first wave of countries willing to recognize the Taliban regime and willing to move in with investments and other engagement. But even they'll be cautious in the near term. They are going to want to see what the Taliban does. They're going to want to wait to see if the Taliban is able to consolidate power, if it's able to gain legitimacy inside the country, which is critical. They're going to wait to see how the security situation plays out. If ISIS continues to carry out attacks against the Taliban, which I think it will, only when these countries get assurances along those lines, political stability, security within the country, only then will they move in. But I think that, quite frankly, the administration has moved on from Afghanistan, and certainly it worries about its competition with China. But I don't think it sees Afghanistan as a priority area for U.S.-China competition. I think that the U.S. recognizes that the Chinese interests actually align with those of the U.S. and Afghanistan. Both countries want more stability, less terrorism. They want infrastructure, investment. So I think that the U.S. it's willing to cede Afghanistan to its rivals, so to speak, even if that may not be it will be a strategic loss for the U.S. for sure, but I think it's something that it can live with, because I think it doesn't view China's role and presence in Afghanistan as damaging and as problematic for U.S. interest as it does China's activities in, say, the South China Sea.
Let's move on to the security agreement between the U.S., Australia, and the U.K. We've seen some strong reactions from countries like France to this agreement. How significant is it?
You're looking at a top Pacific player, Australia, in a position where it is going to be able to develop nuclear-powered submarines, which is a game changer for sure. And of course, the fact that you're looking at another Pacific power, the U.S., contributing to that, along with another major power, the U.K., this is a big deal. And I think that clearly for China and Russia, it certainly is a big blow to them. And so naturally, there's been an angry reaction from Beijing. I think France's angry reaction is understandable, though I think more manageable from a U.S. perspective and from the perspective of all of the countries in AUKUS. Just because France is a partner, it's a close partner of all three of those countries. And I think we've seen already over the last few days, including at the UN General Assembly meetings on the sidelines, some pretty high-level diplomacy between all of the key players, the Australians, the British, the Americans, and the French. As you know, the U.S.-France relationship, although one of America's longest alliances, it's had a lot of problems and it's suffered a lot of blows over the years. But they're manageable. It's a resilient relationship. I think that it will rebound. But I think that the bigger question is how Beijing will respond, because Beijing has already been concerned about the revitalization of the Quad. But with AUKUS, you're looking at an actual security pact. The Quad may be security focused in nature. It's formally called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, but most of the initiatives to come out of it in recent months have been focused on, pandemic cooperation, climate change, technologies, not as directly threatening to China. But when you're talking about a new security pact that entails equipping or giving Australia the capacity to develop nuclear-powered submarines, well, clearly that's a big problem for China, which had already seen its relationship with Australia suffer some major blows. And now China is looking at the reality of two major Indo-Pacific groupings, AUKUS and the Quad, that are meant to counter China. So I think how the arrival of AUKUS on the scene impacts broader strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific, that is something to be watching over the coming weeks and months.
And what does the AUKUS mean for the Indo-Pacific as a whole, for countries in the Asian region? Would this pose a security threat where we would see some sort of a battle between, AUKUS and China in the Indo-Pacific region?
There have not been any strong criticisms of AUKUS from any of the major Asian capitals. And I think what's very striking is that, as I'm sure you know, the Philippine government came out in strong support of AUKUS, which is significant, just because the Philippines is one of these countries in Southeast Asia that has, on the one hand, has a security alliance with the US, but on the other hand, has flirted with China in recent years, particularly in terms of looking for Chinese economic assistance for infrastructure development. So the fact that the Philippines is coming out in support of AUKUS, I think is a pretty big deal. I think that the broader state of play won't change, in the sense that I believe that you're still going to see the countries that had been looking for Chinese economic support. That's going to continue, because no matter what the Quad or the G7 or the US itself says about this idea of bringing infrastructure to the Indo-Pacific and providing free and open rules-based activities, all of that, China is so present with the infrastructure development that it's going to be a long time before the US and its partners are in a position to provide meaningful, sustainable alternatives to China when it comes to infrastructure support. The Indo-Pacific policy that the Trump administration came out with, it has a number of new tools, including the International Development Finance Corporation, the Blue Dot Network, tools that are meant to back and sponsor infrastructure projects that are transparent and equitable and different from those coming from China. But these are all still works in progress. And as I'm sure you know, infrastructure is such a huge need everywhere, not everywhere, but in so many countries, particularly in Asia. And many countries don't have the luxury to just wait around until the US and its partners are in a position to mobilize and provide that support. So I think that the big thing to watch is how certainly the US-China rivalry will certainly intensify even more. But I think in terms of how the countries of the Indo-Pacific respond, I think that they will either openly or more likely quietly be very happy with AUKUS, but they quietly will continue to seek Chinese economic support.
I know you've also been following US-India relations quite closely. and with Prime Minister Modi meeting the Biden administration. How is that developing, the relationship between the US and India and their first high-level talks in Washington?
Yeah, well, there is bipartisan support and has been for quite some time in Washington in favor of a deep US-India relationship. And that's mainly because of the China factor. It hasn't always been that way, but you go back to the early 90s when India liberalized its economy and opened up to the world, and the Cold War ended. That really created opportunities for US-India economic cooperation. It broadened as we got into the post 9/11 era, when the two countries identified Islamist terrorism as a shared threat. And then, of course, in more recent years, the rise of China was something that really brought the two countries together. And the US it views India as its best strategic bet in South Asia for a country that can help the US push back against China, just because of its location, its size, its military power, and so on. I do think sometimes the US may it may exaggerate the capacity of India to play that role. And India, of course, remains cautious with its strategic autonomy principle, where it doesn't like to be brought into these alliances, these security alliances. So there's some issues to be worked out. But the bottom line is that the US-India relationship has experienced exponential growth since the early 2000s. And I think that this meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden was really meant to represent the next phase of that. Biden and Modi are familiar with each other. They've met before. It is a bit ironic in the sense that, as you know, Modi had essentially been denied a visa by the US government for his alleged activities in the Gujarat riots some years ago. So initially, the Obama administration was, not going to let him in. But when he became prime minister, all was forgotten, and India developed a very strong personal relationship with Barack Obama, whose vice president was Joe Biden. But that's sort of an irony that's been forgotten at this point. So the relationship's in a very good place, and I think that the agenda of Biden's meeting with Modi was very broad, and I think that reflects the breadth and the depth of the U.S.-India relationship. I do think that many of the themes highlighted in the meeting between Biden and Modi were also reflective of the issues discussed in the Quad meeting, which of course happened just a few hours later after Biden's meeting with Modi. China, of course, is always in the conversation, but also issues like cooperation on climate change, on working together to deal with the pandemic, working together to deal with cyber threats, and to develop stronger technologies and so on. These are issues of personal interest to both Modi and Biden. And these are also main priority areas for the Quad. Afghanistan, of course, was another issue to discuss, and that's something that's changed since the last time Modi met with the U.S. president, when he met with Trump in India last year. That is a shock, so to speak, to the world order. And that's certainly something that worries India, just because of the fact that the threat of regional terrorism has gone up. So it was not. I'm sure that the meeting with Biden was not. It was not every agenda point was a happy one. But I think for the most part, it was likely a pretty freewheeling and broad-based discussion on a variety of issues.
Right, Michael, we will leave it at that. Thank you for taking time to join us on this program. And to all our viewers, do join us on our next Daily Mirror World Focus. Till then, stay safe.